Hello, friends. All right, today is our last chapter of our book, Flat Stanley by Jeff Brown. So we learned how Flat Stanley got flat, and that was by his bulletin board, and a couple of adventures he went on with his dad and brother. He was a kite. He got mailed to his friend. He caught somebody that was trying to steal art. So we are going to see what happens in the last chapter, called Arthur's Good Idea. So remember, Arthur is his brother. So we are going to see what Arthur suggests for Flat Stanley. For a while, Stanley Lambchop was a famous name. Everywhere that Stanley went, people stared and pointed at him. He could hear them whisper, "Over there! Over there! That must be Stanley Lambchop, the one who caught the sneaky thieves," and things like that. But after a few weeks of whispering and the staring, it stopped. People had other things to think about. Stanley did not mind. Being famous had been fun, but enough was enough. There he is. And then came a further change, and it was not a pleasant one. People began to laugh and make fun of him as he passed by. "Hello, Super Skinny," they would shout, and even ruder things about the way he looked. Stanley told his parents how he felt. "It's the other kids I mostly mind," he said. "They don't like me anymore because I'm different. I'm flat." "Shame on them," Miss Lambchop said. "It's wrong to dislike people for their shapes, or their religion for that matter, or the color of their skin." "I know," Stanley said. "Only maybe it's impossible for everybody to like everybody." "Perhaps," said Mrs. Lambchop, "but they could try." Later that night, Arthur Lambchop was woken up by a sound of crying. In the darkness, he crept across the room and knelt by Stanley's bed. "Are you okay?" he said. "Go away," Stanley said. "Don't be mad at me," Arthur said. "You're still mad because I let you get tangled up the day you were my kite, I guess." "Skip it, will ya?" Stanley said. "I'm not mad. Go away." "Please, let's be friends." Arthur couldn't help crying a little too. "Oh, Stanley, please tell me what's wrong." Stanley waited for a long time before he spoke. "The thing is, I'm just not happy anymore. I'm tired of being flat. I want to be a regular shape again, like all the other people. But I'll have to go on being flat forever. It makes me sick." "Oh, Stanley," Arthur said. He dried his tears on the corner of Stanley's sheet and could think of nothing more to say. "Don't talk about what I just said," Stanley told him. "I don't want the folks to worry. That would only make things worse." There he is, really sad. "You're brave," Arthur said. "You really, really are." He took hold of Stanley's hand, and the two brothers sat together in darkness, being friends. They were both still a little sad, but each one felt a little better than they had before. And then, suddenly, though it was not even trying to think, Arthur had an idea. He jumped up and turned on the light and ran to the big storage box where the toys and things were kept. He began to rummage in the box. Stanley stood up in bed to watch. Arthur flung aside a football and some lead soldiers and an airplane model and lots of wood blocks, and then he said, "Aha!" And he found what he wanted, an old bicycle pump. He held it up, and Stanley looked. And, "Okay," Stanley said, "but take it easy. Put the end of the long pump hose in my mouth and clamp down tightly so no air could escape." "I'll go slowly," Arthur said, "but if it hurts, wiggle your hand at me." He began to pump. At first nothing happened except Stanley's cheeks bulged a little bit. Arthur watched his hand, but there was no wiggle signal, so he pumped. And then Stanley's top half began to swell. "It's working! It's working!" shouted Arthur, pumping away. Stanley spread his arms so that air could get around inside him more easily. He got bigger and bigger and bigger, and the buttons of his pajamas burst off. Pop, pop, pop. A moment more, and he was all rounded out. Head, body, arms, legs. But not his right foot. That stayed flat. Arthur stopped pumping. It's like trying to do the very last bit of those long balloons, he said. There he is, getting blown up, trying to get back to normal. Maybe a shake will help. Stanley shook his right foot twice, and with a little whooshing sound, it swelled out to match the left one. There stood Stanley Lambchop as he used to be, as if he had never been flat at all. Thank you, Arthur, Stanley said. Thank you so much. The brothers were shaking hands when Mr. Lambchop strode into the room with Mrs. Lambchop right behind him. We heard you, said Mr. Lambchop, up talking when you ought to be sleeping. Shame on George, Miss Lambchop. Stanley's real again. You're right, said Mr. Lambchop. Good for you, Stanley. I'm the one who did it, Arthur said. I blew him up. Everyone was terribly excited and happy, of course. Miss Lambchop made hot chocolate to celebrate the occasion. There they all are. Oop, oop. Several toasts were taken and they drank to Arthur for his cleverness. When the little party was over, Mr. and Mrs. Lambchop tucked the boys back in their beds and kissed them, and they turned out the light. Good night, they said. Good night, said Stanley and Arthur. It had been a long and tiring day. Very soon all the Lambchops were asleep. The end. Oh my gosh, that is the end of our friend Flat Stanley. Now, there is more books. There is a book called Flat Stanley, and Stanley is flat again in that book. So, I don't have that book, but if I find it, I will make another recording of those chapters. But this was a cute book. So I hope you enjoyed Flat Stanley by Jeff Brown. And it was just a fun thing to read. So, Mrs. Reed got Junie B. Jones. Now, Junie B., she goes to first grade. So, just like you guys are going to first grade, Mrs. Reed is going to read you book 1 in this one. So, tune in tomorrow for Junie B. Jones and going to first grade. So, I will see you then. Bye, friends.